Hey guys, tonight we begin not with fairy dust or enchanted forests, but with something far more powerful and complicated. Falling in love in the shadow of war, because, believe it or not, finding romance in post-war England, when the bombs had stopped falling but the scars remained, was somehow even more challenging than navigating the minefield of modern dating. From country estates struggling to survive to forbidden elopements in ancient woods. Love in 1946 was less about happy endings and more about choosing hope when the world had forgotten how. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe it, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Together to a midsummer night in England where nothing is quite as it seems, and love might just survive the darkness. The summer of 1946 arrived like a sigh of relief across the English countryside. Though the weight of war still pressed against every heart that beat beneath those grey and resilient skies, at Ashwood Manor, the ancient estate that had weathered centuries of English history, preparations were underway for the Midsummer Garden Party, a celebration of victory, of survival, of the fragile hope that peace might truly last this time. The manor itself stood proud against the Warwickshire landscape, its stone facade pockmarked here and there from the Blitz, its gardens somewhat overgrown from years when groundskeepers had gone to fight and never returned. Yet there was beauty still in its weathered grandeur, in the way afternoon light caught the leaded windows, in the ancient oak woods that bordered the property like sentinels guarding secrets older than memory. Lord Edmund Theseus, master of Ashwood Manor, stood in his study with its smell of pipe tobacco and old leather, addressing his daughter Catherine with the stern authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He was a tall figure, ramrod straight, despite his 58 years, his RAF officer's bearing never quite leaving him, even in civilian clothes. The war had aged him, carved lines into his face that spoke of nights spent listening to bomber engines overhead, of telegrams delivered at dawn. "You will marry James Demetrius," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. "His family's fortune will secure Ashwood's future. The estate taxes alone will bankrupt us within the year if we don't act sensibly. Romance is a luxury we can no longer afford, Catherine. The war taught us that." If nothing else, Catherine Hermia Theseus stood before her father's desk in a simple blue dress that had been fashionable before the war. Let out and taken in multiple times during the rationing years, she was 23, dark-haired and dark-eyed, with the kind of beauty that didn't announce itself but crept up on a person, quiet, stubborn, steadfast. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I don't love James Demetrius, father. I love Alexander Lysander. He served with honor, came home when so many didn't. He's a good man with empty pockets and no prospects," Lord Theseus replied, not unkindly, but with the practicality that had kept Ashwood standing for 400 years. "Lieutenant Lysander may have been decorated for bravery, but bravery doesn't pay death duties. You have until the midsummer celebration, 4 days hence, to accept James's proposal properly, or I shall have no choice but to cut you off entirely." "I'm sorry, Catherine, but this is how the world works. This is how it has always worked." Catherine left her father's study with tears threatening behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall until she'd reached the overgrown rose garden where Alexander waited. He'd been leaning against the sun-warmed stone wall, smoking a cigarette, a habit acquired in the trenches of North Africa, but he straightened when he saw her face. ground the cigarette beneath his boot, and opened his arms. Alexander Lysander was 26, tall and lean in a way that suggested meals skipped and hardships endured. His left hand bore shiny scar tissue from burns received pulling a fellow soldier from a burning tank. He wore a threadbare suit that had belonged to his father, and his dark blonde hair needed cutting, but his grey eyes held a gentleness that made Catherine feel safe in a world that had forgotten what safety meant. "He won't relent," Catherine whispered against Alexander's shoulder. "Father insists I marry James or face complete disinheritance. Then we'll run away," Alexander said immediately, with the decisive courage that had earned him his medals. "Tonight. My aunt lives in France, near Lyon. We can marry there, start fresh. The world's changing, Catherine. The old rules don't have to bind us anymore. We fought a war for freedom, doesn't that mean our freedom too?" Before Catherine could answer, footsteps crunched on the gravel path. Helena Goodwin appeared, breathless and flushed, her red hair escaping its pins, her nurse's uniform still on from her shift at the village clinic. Helena had been Catherine's dearest friend since childhood, had nursed wounded soldiers through the war with tireless dedication, and carried a secret that had hollowed her out from the inside. She loved James Demetrius with a desperate, unrequited passion that consumed her every waking thought. "Catherine, I've just come from the village," Helena gasped. "James is looking for you. He's brought his mother to meet with your father. They're planning to announce the engagement at the Midsummer Party." Catherine's face went pale. Alexander's jaw tightened, his hand instinctively reaching for hers. Helena stood before them, her own heart breaking even as she delivered news that shattered her friend's world, because Helena knew that if Catherine refused, James, perhaps just perhaps he, might finally notice the woman who had loved him since they were children playing in these very gardens before the world had gone mad. "Then we leave tonight," Alexander said firmly. "Catherine, pack only what you can carry. We'll take the train from the village station to London, then the ferry to Calais by morning. Your father can't stop us once we're across the channel." Helena's eyes widened. "Catherine, you can't be serious. Running away, your father will never forgive you. And the scandal will fade," Catherine interrupted, her voice stronger now, decision crystallizing into resolve. "Helena, I cannot marry a man I do and love simply because his bank account is fuller than his heart. Alexander and I will meet at midnight in the oak woods by the old gamekeeper's cottage. No one uses it any more since Mr. Fletcher died at Dunkirk." Helena watched them make their plans, watched Catherine's face glow with determined hope, watched Alexander kiss Catherine's hand with such tenderness that Helena had to look away because it hurt too much to witness. A love so freely given when her own went unnoticed and unwanted. As Catherine hurried back toward the manor to prepare, Helena made a decision that shame would haunt her for years to come. She would tell James about the elopement. Perhaps if she helped him, if she proved her devotion, he might finally see her as something more than his former playmate. The doctor's daughter, the plain girl who had always been there in the background of his privileged life. The afternoon shadows lengthened across Ashwood's grounds. In the village of Ashwood-under-Hill, at the Boar's Head pub, a group of working men gathered around a scarred wooden table, sticky with spilled beer. These were the men too old to have fought, or those who'd returned broken in ways not always visible. Peter Quince, the grocer, with his shell-shock tremors. Nick Bottom, the butcher who'd lost an ear to shrapnel. Francis Flute, the baker's son, with lungs damaged by gas. Tom Snout, the tinsmith, who'd spent 3 years in a German POW camp. Robin Starveling, the tailor, who'd watched his shop burn during a bombing raid, and Snug, the carpenter, whose stutter had kept him from service, but not from shame. Peter Quince spread a wrinkled script across the table, his hands shaking only slightly better today than yesterday. "Gentlemen, Lord Theseus has requested entertainment for the midsummer celebration. I propose we perform a theatrical piece, something classical, dignified. We'll show those manor folk that working men can appreciate culture. Nick Bottom, a broad-shouldered man with a booming voice and opinions to match, leaned forward eagerly. His missing ear was hidden beneath hair grown deliberately long. I'll play the lead, naturally. I've always had theatrical inclinations. During the war, I performed for the troops' recitations, dramatic readings. Very well received. The piece is Pyramus and Thisbe, Quince continued, ignoring Bottom's presumption. A tragic love story, very appropriate for a summer celebration. His voice carried the careful pronunciation of a self-educated man, someone who'd learned proper speech from BBC wireless broadcasts during long blackout nights. Tom Snout, gaunt and grey-faced, lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. Tragedy, haven't we had enough of that? Half the village is in mourning. Young Fletcher, the Davies boys, Susan Palmer's husband, all buried in foreign soil. Maybe we should do a comedy instead. It ends, hopefully, Quince insisted. The lovers are united in death, transcending earthly suffering. There's beauty in that. Robin Starveling, a thin, nervous man who jumped at sudden noises, said quietly, I'll sew the costumes. I've enough fabric saved, though the rationings made quality material scarce. We'll make do. We always make do. They bent over the script together, these damaged men seeking purpose in pageantry, finding dignity in drama, hoping that performance might help them forget, for a few hours, the things they'd seen and done and survived. As dusk settled over Ashwood Manor and village alike, other figures stirred in the ancient oak woods. The trees here had stood for centuries, had sheltered Saxon rebels and hidden Catholic priests and concealed poachers from hanging. Now they harbored different secrets. Deep in the woods, where moonlight barely penetrated the canopy, where old stone circles marked pagan worship sites long forgotten, a group of individuals moved with practiced silence. These were the foresters, as the villagers called them in whispers, individuals who'd operated in shadows during the war, whose official records had been sealed, whose true roles would never be acknowledged by grateful governments. They had been intelligence operatives, resistance coordinators, saboteurs, and spies. Now, in peacetime, they found themselves unable or unwilling to return to ordinary civilian life. The woods had become their domain, their kingdom of secrets. Oberon Fairfax moved through the twilight forest like smoke, his dark clothing making him nearly invisible. He'd been a handler for MI6 operatives behind enemy lines, had coordinated drops and extractions across occupied Europe, had sent men and women to their deaths with nothing but his word to guide them. He was 42, silver-haired and sharp-featured, with the kind of intense gaze that seemed to see through pretense straight into souls. The war had given him power over life and death, and peace had not entirely convinced him to relinquish that power. His wife, Tatiana Fairfax, waited in a clearing where an ancient stone circle stood draped in ivy and memory. She'd been a Soviet intelligence officer who'd defected to Britain in 1958, bringing secrets that had helped turn the tide of war. Tatiana was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful, sharp edges and calculated grace. Red lips and eyes that revealed nothing. She and Oberon had married for practical reasons during the war, a union of convenience between allies. Now that alliance was fracturing. Between them, wrapped in a blanket, slept a child, a French orphan they'd rescued from a destroyed village during the liberation. The boy, perhaps 4 years old, had become the focus of their Cold War. Oberon believed the child should be sent to his surviving relatives in India, where the boy's father had been born. Tatiana refused to surrender the boy she'd come to love as her own. "You're being irrational," Oberon said coldly, standing at the edge of the clearing but coming no closer. "The boy has family. We are not his parents, Tatiana. We are operatives who happened to find him. Nothing more. You feel nothing, do you?" Tatiana's accent thickened with emotion, the Russian vowels she usually suppressed breaking through her careful English. "This child has lost everything. We can give him safety, love, a future. But you want to ship him away like cargo because it's tidier, more efficient. This is why we are finished, Oberon. You have forgotten how to be human." Robin Goodfellow, called Puck by everyone who knew him, emerged from the trees at that moment, a battered rucksack over his shoulder. Puck was 28, wiry and quick, with a scarred face that bore witness to a motorcycle accident during a hasty escape from Berlin. He'd been a courier and infiltrator during the war, spoke 7 languages fluently, and possessed an uncanny talent for reading people and situations. He was loyal to Oberon above all else, having been recruited as a teenager and shaped entirely by the older man's influence. "Sir," Puck said, his voice carrying traces of East London beneath cultivated BBC English. "The manor is preparing for the midsummer celebration. Several interesting situations developing. Lord Theseus is forcing his daughter to marry the Demetrius boy. The daughter plans to elope tonight with a former lieutenant, and there's a lovesick nurse who's going to betray the elopement to the very man the daughter is trying to escape." Oberon's expression shifted, something almost like amusement touching his austere features. "How deliciously complicated. Young people and their dramas. We were young once," Tatiana said bitterly. "Before the war taught us that love was weakness." Oberon ignored her, reaching into his coat pocket. He withdrew a small glass vial containing a clear liquid. "During the war, they'd used various substances, serums, sedatives, stimulant stools of the intelligence trade. This particular compound had been developed in a secret laboratory, a powerful extract derived from rare flowers, something that induced a state of heightened suggestibility. In the right hands, it could make a person susceptible to persuasion, could alter their emotional fixations temporarily. Puck, I want you to find James Demetrius when he enters the woods hunting his escaping bride. Apply this to him while he sleeps. Make him fixate on the first woman he sees upon waking, this Helena who loves him. Let him experience obsessive devotion for once, rather than being its object. Consider it a lesson in empathy." Puck took the vial, grinning. "And if I happen to cause a bit of chaos in the process?" "Chaos builds character," Oberon replied. "The young people will sort themselves out by morning, probably with a better understanding of their own hearts. We did far worse during the war in service of greater goods." Tatiana stood abruptly, the sleeping child in her arms. "You're still playing God, Oberon. Still manipulating lives like chess pieces. I want nothing to do with your games anymore. I'm taking the boy and leaving. You'll have to send Puck to drag us back, and we both know you won't cross that line. Even you have limits." She disappeared into the woods without looking back, leaving Oberon standing alone in the clearing as darkness completed its conquest of the sky. For a moment, something like regret flickered across his face, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Midnight approached. In her bedroom at Ashwood Manor, Catherine packed a small suitcase. In the village, Helena walked toward the manor to find James. In the woods, Alexander waited by the gamekeeper's cottage, and in the Boar's Head pub, the amateur players planned their rehearsal in those same woods, unaware that the forest was about to become a stage for far stranger performances than Pyramus and Thisbe. The clock in Ashwood Manor's entrance hall struck midnight with 12 solemn chimes that echoed through corridors where ancestral portraits watched with painted eyes. Catherine descended the servants' staircase, her small suitcase gripped tightly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wore practical traveling clothes, a dark skirt and jacket, sturdy shoes suitable for walking through woods and catching trains. Around her neck hung her mother's locket, the only truly valuable thing she was taking from her old life. The manor's back door creaked as she eased it open, and she froze, certain the sound would wake the entire household. But no lights flickered on, no voices called out. The house slept on, unaware that one of its own was fleeing into the night. Catherine crossed the lawn quickly, keeping to shadows, until the manicured gardens gave way to rougher ground, and then to the tree line where the oak woods began. The forest at night was a different world entirely. During daylight hours, these woods were familiar territory, childhood haunts, where she'd played explorer and built fairy houses from twigs and moss. But darkness transformed the familiar into something ancient and unknowable. The canopy blocked most of the moonlight, creating a labyrinth of shadow and deeper shadow. Tree roots seemed to shift beneath her feet, branches reached out like skeletal fingers. Every sound, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth, the whisper of wind through leaves made her pulse quicken. Yet she pressed forward, following the old gamekeeper's path from memory, thinking of Alexander waiting for her, thinking of France, and freedom and a future they would build together far from her father's disappointment and duty's crushing weight. Behind her, perhaps 15 minutes back, James Demetrius strode through the same woods with a hunter's determined pace. Helena had found him in the manor's smoking room, had breathlessly revealed the elopement plan, had watched his handsome face transform from surprised to insulted to grimly resolved. James was 25, dark-haired and broad-shouldered, with the kind of classical good looks that had always ensured admiration without effort. His family's shipping fortune had survived the war intact, had perhaps even profited from it in ways not discussed in polite company. "I'll stop this foolishness," he'd declared. "Catherine is overtired, emotional. Women often are. She doesn't know her own mind. I'll find them, send Lysander packing, and bring Catherine home where she belongs." Helena had followed him when he'd stormed from the manor, had called after him, had begged to come along. "James, please, just listen to me. If Catherine doesn't love you, why force this? Let her go. Let her be happy. There are others who would cherish the chance to not now, Helena." He'd snapped without even looking at her, his long strides carrying him quickly into the trees. "Go home. This doesn't concern you." But Helena had not gone home. She'd followed him into the woods, stumbling over roots in her nurse's practical shoes, branches catching at her hair and clothes, tears streaming down her face because she'd betrayed her dearest friend for a man who could uneven see her as human, who treated her as furniture, as background scenery in the story of his own importance. Deeper in the forest, Alexander paced before the gamekeeper's cottage, checking his watch every few minutes by the light of matches that kept burning down to his fingers. The cottage was barely standing, its roof sagged, its windows were empty frames, its door hung crooked on broken hinges. Old Fletcher had lived here for 40 years before the war had taken him, before Dunkirk's beaches had claimed another life in the vast accounting of the dead. A photograph of his parents who'd died in the Blitz. The money he'd saved from his army paid enough to get them to France, but not much beyond. He was gambling everything on love, on the faith that Catherine's courage would match his own. that together they could build something better than the world that had tried to destroy them. A sound in the woods made him turn sharply, his soldier's instincts still sharp. "Catherine," he called softly. But it wasn't Catherine who emerged from the shadows. It was Puck, moving with the eerie silence of someone trained to kill without being heard. In the war, Puck had slipped past German sentries, had entered occupied buildings, had done things that would never appear in any official history. Old habits died hard. "Cigarette, mate?" Puck asked casually, offering a crumpled pack. "Bloody dark night for a walk." Alexander relaxed slightly. "Waiting for someone, actually." "You're out late yourself, could say the same," Puck replied, studying the young man with professional assessment. This was the romantic hero, then the decorated soldier willing to sacrifice everything for love. Puck had seen men like this during the war, the ones who believed in causes and honor and happy endings. They smoked together in companionable silence for a moment, two men shaped by war standing in darkness. Then Puck melted back into the forest as soundlessly as he'd appeared, leaving Alexander alone again with his hopes and his watch and the increasingly anxious conviction that something had gone wrong. Catherine was lost. She'd taken a wrong turning somewhere, had missed the fork in the path where the old oak split by lightning should have marked her way. Now she wandered deeper into unfamiliar territory where the trees grew more densely, where the darkness seemed almost solid. Her suitcase grew heavier with each step. Panic fluttered in her chest. She called out softly for Alexander, but the forest swallowed her voice and gave nothing back. In another part of the woods, near a small clearing where moonlight managed to penetrate the canopy, the amateur theatrical troupe from the village had gathered for their first rehearsal. Peter Quince held the script in trembling hands, trying to maintain authority over his chaotic company. "Gentlemen, please," Quince said, his shell-shock stutter more pronounced in his anxiety. "We must take this as seriously. The performance is in 3 days. Bottom, you'll play Pyramus. Flute, your Thisbe. We need someone who can manage a woman's voice. Francis, flute." A soft-spoken young man whose damaged lungs made prolonged speech difficult, protested weakly, "But I've got a beard coming in. How can I play a lady?" "You'll wear a mask," Quince insisted. "Snout, you'll be the wall. Snug, you're the lion. Starveling, the moonshine." Nick Bottom stood, drawing himself up importantly. "I should play all the parts. I have the range, the theatrical instinct. One could be Pyramus, tragic and noble," he struck a melodramatic pose, "or the lion, fierce and terrifying. I do an excellent roar." "Please don't roar," Tom Snout whispered urgently. "We're in the woods at night. You'll wake whatever's out here." "Ghosts, you mean?" Robin Starveling said nervously. "They say these woods are haunted. Fletcher's spirit walks here, they say, and others from older times." "Sometimes I think I see no ghost talk," Quince interrupted firmly. "We're rational men living in modern times. The un-1940s, for heaven's sake. We have aeroplanes and wireless and atom bombs. There are no such things as ghosts." But even as he spoke, they all felt it, that sense of being watched, of the forest holding its breath around them. These were men who'd learned to trust their instincts for danger, who'd survived because they could sense threats before seeing them. Something in these woods tonight felt wrong, felt charged with possibility and peril. They began rehearsing, their voices stilted and self-conscious. Bottom overacting magnificently while the others stumbled through their lines. None of them noticed Puck crouched in the undergrowth nearby. watching with amused contempt these ordinary men playing at art. James Demetrius, meanwhile, had found Catherine's trail. He was a skilled tracker, had hunted these estates since boyhood, and, even in darkness, he could read signs: a footprint in soft earth, a broken twig, the disturbed moss where someone had stumbled. His anger had cooled into something colder and more determined. Catherine was his, had been promised to him, and he would not be humiliated by losing her to a penniless nobody with nothing to offer but romantic gestures. Helena followed at a distance, her initial regret transforming into bitter desperation. She'd loved James since they were children, had watched him grow from boy to man while remaining invisible to him, had nursed wounded soldiers through the war while dreaming it was James she tended, had preserved her hope through 6 years of hell because the thought of him kept her human when everything else urged her toward despair. "James, please, stop," she called out, no longer caring if he heard her following. "This is madness. You can't force someone to love you. Believe me, I know. I've tried to stop loving you 1,000 times, and I can't. But I would never force you to return it. That's not love, that's ownership." He whirled on her, his face shadowed and strange in the scattered moonlight. "Why are you here, Helena? Why do you always hover at the edges of my life like some pathetic ghost? Can you not take a hint? I don't love you. I will never love you. You're like a sister to me. No, not even that. You're familiar, like old furniture. I don't think about you at all." The words struck her like physical blows. Helena stopped walking, stopped breathing for a moment. The cruelty of his honesty worse than years of being ignored. She stood frozen in the middle of the forest path, while James continued onward without looking back, without caring that he'd just shattered whatever fragile dignity she'd been clinging to. Puck, observing from the shadows, felt something almost like sympathy and emotion he'd thought the war had burned out of him. This Helena was pathetic, yes, but there was something noble in her pathetic devotion, and James Demetrius was exactly the kind of entitled bastard Puck had learned to despise during his years in the service, the officers who treated working-class soldiers as expendable who returned from war to inherited wealth while men like Puck scrambled for survival. Oberon's orders had been to apply the compound to James, to make him fixate on Helena, but perhaps the real chaos, the real lesson, would come from slightly different applications. Puck made his decision with the swift certainty that had kept him alive through the war. He would improve upon Oberon's plan, would create a more poetic chaos. He slipped through the forest like a fox, following Alexander back toward the gamekeeper's cottage, where the young lieutenant had finally given up waiting in one spot and begun searching. Alexander stumbled along an overgrown path, calling Catherine's name with increasing desperation. The woods seemed to shift around him, paths branching and twisting in ways he didn't remember from childhood explorations. His torch battery was dying, the beam growing dimmer with each passing moment. Exhaustion finally overcame him. He sank down against a massive oak trunk, intending to rest for just a moment, to gather his thoughts and plan his next move. But the adrenaline that had sustained him was fading, and the sleepless night before spent planning their escape dragged at him like weighted chains. His eyes closed, despite his best intentions. Puck emerged from the darkness, silent as death. He uncorked the vial, applied 3 careful drops to Alexander's closed eyelids, the clear liquid absorbing instantly into skin. The compound worked quickly, entering the bloodstream, reaching the brain, creating new neural pathways of obsession and desire. In the morning, the effect would fade, leaving only confusion and perhaps a headache, but for the next few hours, Alexander Lysander would fixate completely on the first woman he saw upon waking, would believe himself desperately in love, regardless of previous attachments. "Sleep well, Romeo," Puck whispered. "You'll wake up with a different Juliet entirely." He moved on, tracking James through the forest with professional ease. The young aristocrat had stopped to light a cigarette, was studying the ground for more signs of Catherine's passage. Puck watched him for a moment, this handsome, entitled man who'd never known real hardship, who treated love as a commodity to be acquired rather than a gift to be cherished. A noise in the undergrowth made James turn sharply. "Catherine, is that you?" Helena emerged instead, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her hair a tangled mess, her dignity in absolute ruins. "It's only me," she said bitterly. "Only ever me, following where I'm not wanted, loving where I'm not loved. For God's sake, woman, go home," James snapped. "I don't have time for your histrionics. I'm trying to prevent a catastrophic mistake." "The catastrophic mistake is mine," Helena replied, her voice breaking. "Loving you has destroyed me. I wish I could stop. I wish I could feel nothing at all." James turned away dismissively, scanning the dark woods for any sign of Catherine. His arrogance, his complete disregard for Helena's suffering, decided Puck's next move. He waited until James had walked on another 20 yards, until the young man stumbled over a root and cursed, until exhaustion and frustration made him sit heavily on a fallen log to catch his breath. The forest was taking its toll on everyone. Even James, with his hunter's knowledge and physical conditioning, was feeling the disorienting effect of darkness and twisted paths, and the psychological weight of these ancient woods. He leaned back against the log, closing his eyes just for a moment, just to rest. Puck was there instantly. 3 drops on the eyelids, the vial corked and pocketed, and then back into the shadows before James stirred. Perfect. When James woke, he would fixate on the first woman he saw, and given that Helena was trailing behind him like a faithful hound, the mathematics of chaos were simple and elegant. Catherine, meanwhile, had finally found her way to the gamekeeper's cottage. By sheer luck and stubborn determination, she saw the familiar, broken structure through the trees and nearly wept with relief. But when she reached the small clearing, Alexander was nowhere to be seen. "Alexander," she called softly. "Alexander, I'm here. I'm sorry I'm late. I got lost." Silence answered her. The cottage stood empty and forsaken. Her suitcase slipped from her numb fingers. Had he given up on her? Had he decided she wasn't coming and left without her? The thought was unbearable. She sank down on the cottage's sagging front step, tears finally overwhelming her careful composure. In their clearing deeper in the woods, Tatiana sat with the sleeping child in her arms while Oberon stood at a distance, the chasm between them as vast as the one that had divided Europe during the war. They had been partners once, allies bound by common purpose. Now they were strangers who happened to know each other's secrets. "You really mean to leave?" Oberon said. It wasn't a question. "I do," Tatiana replied. "I have money saved, documents prepared. By tomorrow we'll be on a ship to America. A new life, far from all of this. The boy deserves to know his heritage, his family. The boy deserves safety and love. Those are the only things that matter now. The war should have taught us that, but it taught you nothing except how to manipulate and control." Oberon was silent for a long moment. Then, with visible effort, he said, "Perhaps you're right. Perhaps I have forgotten what matters. Keep the boy, Tatiana. I won't stop you. But know this: you were the only person I ever truly trusted. Losing you is worse than losing the war would have been. It was the closest thing to vulnerability he'd shown in years, perhaps ever." Tatiana looked at him across the clearing, seeing for a moment the man she demarried before duty and death had hollowed them both out from the inside. But it's too late, Tatiana said quietly, standing with the child. Some things, once broken, cannot be mended. We both know this. We've seen it too many times. She walked away into the darkness, and Oberon let her go, standing alone in the clearing like a monument to his own cold efficiency. The war had made them both into weapons, and weapons were not designed for love or family or the gentle, ordinary life that peace demanded. He understood this intellectually, but understanding did nothing to ease the strange, hollow feeling in his chest. Puck returned to find his mentor standing motionless in the moonlight. "It's done, sir." Both young men dosed as instructed. "By dawn we'll have a proper farce on our hands." "And my wife?" Oberon asked. "Gone, sir." "But you knew she would be." Oberon nodded slowly. "The boy will be happier with her. She still remembers how to be human." "I'm not certain I do anymore." He turned to Puck. "Let's observe our handiwork. I want to see these young people sort through their manufactured emotions. Perhaps there's something to be learned about the nature of love, whether it's chemistry or choice, fate or feeling." They moved through the forest like ghosts, like the intelligence operatives they'd been observing without being seen. In the clearing where the amateur players rehearsed, chaos of a different sort was unfolding. Nick Bottom had just delivered Perimus' death speech with such bombastic overacting that even the patient Quince was losing his temper. "Bottom, please, you're supposed to be dying tragically, not performing at a music hall," Quince protested. "Show some restraint, some dignity. I'm showing passion," Bottom retorted. "The audience wants passion. They want to feel something. God knows we've all felt enough death these past years. Might as well make it meaningful on stage." There was uncomfortable truth in that. They'd all lost people, had all attended funerals for young men buried in foreign soil or scattered as ash across battlefields. Making theatre from tragedy felt both therapeutic and somehow wrong, like dancing on graves. France's flute, attempting Thisbe's lines in a falsetto that kept breaking into coughs, finally had to stop to catch his damaged breath. Robin Starveling offered him water from a canteen, the gesture automatic they'd all learned to look after each other during the war, that instinct for collective survival. "Perhaps we should rest," Tom Snout suggested. "It's late. We're all tired." And he paused, listening. "Did you hear that?" They all froze. There was definitely movement in the woods around them, branches breaking, footsteps, voices. The clearing suddenly felt very exposed, very vulnerable. These were men who'd learned to fear sounds in darkness, who associated night noises with sirens and bombers and death falling from above. "Probably just deer," Snug said, though his stutter suggested he didn't believe it. Puck, watching from concealment, felt mischief rising in him, the same impulse that had made him a terror behind enemy lines, that had led him to take unnecessary risks just to see what would happen. These village men, with their earnest little play, their working-class aspirations to culture, they needed shaking up, needed reminding that the world was stranger and more dangerous than their provincial lives suggested. He circled around behind Bottom, who'd wandered slightly away from the group to practice his death throws privately, with quick, practiced movements. Puck struck, using techniques learned in unarmed combat training. A pressure point that caused temporary unconsciousness, a few seconds of vulnerability. When Bottom woke moments later, his head was swimming and something felt wrong. His face felt strange, heavy. He touched his head and found what was that. His hands encountered something that shouldn't be there, something that felt like fur and foreign flesh. Puck had worked quickly, using a prop from his rucksacker, remarkably realistic donkey mask they'd used during the war for a deception operation. Something about confusing German reconnaissance with false livestock movements. He'd secured it to Bottom's head with theatrical adhesive, making it nearly impossible to remove without solvent. Bottom stumbled back into the clearing. "Fellows, something's happened. I feel very strange. Is my face?" The other players turned, saw Bottom's appearance, his body normal but his head, now that of a donkey. Grotesque and impossible and utterly terrifying in the moonlit clearing, and pandemonium erupted. "Demon!" Starveling shrieked, his already frayed nerves shattering completely. "The woods are cursed!" Snout yelled, dropping his script and running. "Every man for himself!" Quince shouted, his stammer vanishing in pure terror. They scattered like startled birds, crashing through the undergrowth, leaving Bottoms standing alone and bewildered in the clearing, his voice muffled by the mask. "Wait, come back. It's still me. I'm still Bottom." But they were gone, fled into the forest, leaving him isolated and increasingly frightened despite his attempts at bravery. Bottom stood alone in the clearing, his heart pounding beneath the ridiculous mask. The war had taught him courage in the face of bullets and bombs, but this supernatural strangeness unnerved him more than combat ever had. He tried again to remove the mask, pulling and twisting, but whatever adhesive held it refused to yield. "Right then," he said aloud, his voice echoing oddly inside the mask, "if I'm to be a monster, I'll be a brave one. I'll sing to keep my spirits up, to show I'm not afraid." He began to sing an old music hall tune he'd learned as a boy, before the world had gone to war, when England still believed in its own invincibility. His voice, naturally loud, boomed through the forest, startling night birds from their roosts. The singing reached Tatiana where she'd stopped to rest, the child still sleeping peacefully in her arms. She'd been walking for hours, following paths she knew would take her eventually to a village station, then to London, then to freedom. But exhaustion had finally claimed her. She'd settled against a tree, had closed her eyes just for a moment. The singing woke her, and she found herself disoriented, still half caught in dreams. The compound Oberon had developed wasn't only for use on others during the war. They'd both been exposed to various substances, had built up tolerances to some things and sensitivities to others. The forest air tonight carried pollen and spores, natural compounds that mixed strangely with her altered brain chemistry. She saw Bottom emerge into a shaft of moonlight. This creature that was half man and half beast, and something in her war-damaged mind found him beautiful. Here was honesty, she thought. A man who wore his true nature on the outside, rather than hiding monstrosity behind a handsome face like Oberon did. "You there," she called out, her accent thick, her judgment clouded. "Stop." Bottom turned, startled to find a beautiful woman watching him from the shadows. Even through the disorientation of his situation, he recognized Tatiana, the mysterious foreign woman who lived in the woods, whom villagers whispered about, whom children were warned away from. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I apologize if my singing disturbed you. I'm having a rather unusual evening." "Your voice is magnificent," Tatiana said, standing and moving toward him with the sleeping child. Her exhaustion and emotional devastation and the strange chemistry of the forest combined to create something like temporary madness. "You are magnificent. I have spent years surrounded by men who hide what they are, who wear faces that lie. But you show your true self without shame." Bottom backed away, confused and increasingly alarmed. "I'm just a butcher from the village, ma'am. This," he gestured at the mask, "this isn't my true self. It's some sort of trick, a curse, I don't know what." "Come with me," Tatiana insisted, reaching for his hand. "Let me care for you. You deserve gentleness, kindness. The world has been cruel too long." She was clearly unwell, clearly not herself, but there was something compelling in her desperation. Bottom, who'd spent the war years being ordered about by officers who treated him as expendable, found himself oddly moved by this strange woman's attention. "Ma'am, I really should be getting back to the village. My friends will worry. Your friends abandoned you," Tatiana pointed out with ruthless accuracy. "They ran away screaming. But I see you. I see your worth." Not far away, Alexander stirred from his drugged sleep. The compound was working through his system, rewriting his emotional circuitry temporarily. He opened his eyes, groggy and confused, with no clear memory of why he was sleeping against a tree in the middle of the woods. Helena stumbled past at that exact moment, still trailing after James, still lost in her own misery. She was crying quietly, not watching where she was going, and nearly tripped over Alexander's outstretched legs. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she gasped, looking down at him. Their eyes met, and the compound did its work. Alexander saw Helena really, saw her for what felt like the first time, and his heart lurched with sudden, overwhelming devotion. This woman with her red hair catching moonlight, her tear-stained face showing such raw emotion, her very presence seeming to radiate an ethereal beauty he couldn't believe he'd never noticed before. "You," he breathed, climbing to his feet. "You're the most beautiful creature I've ever seen. What's your name? Tell me your name." Helena stared at him, confused. "Alexander. It's me, Helena. Catherine's friend. Are you all right? You look strange." "Helena," he repeated reverently, as if the name were a prayer. "Beautiful Helena. How could I have been so blind? I thought I loved Catherine, but that was nothing, a pale shadow compared to what I feel looking at you now. You are the sun, and I have been stumbling in darkness." "This isn't funny," Helena said, backing away. "If James put you up to mocking me, mock you. I worship you," Alexander declared with absolute sincerity, reaching for her hands. "Every fiber of my being cries out for you. Say you'll have me. Say you'll let me spend my life proving my devotion." Helena turned and ran, convinced this was some cruel joke, some elaborate torment designed to punish her for her earlier betrayal of Catherine. Alexander chased after her, calling declarations of love that echoed through the forest. James Demetrius woke to the sound of shouting in the distance. The compound had worked through his system while he slept, and he rose with a splitting headache and a strange sense of disorientation. His clothes were damp with dew, his expensive watch showed 3 in the morning, and he had no clear memory of falling asleep. Catherine appeared through the trees at that moment, having heard voices and followed them desperately, still searching for Alexander. She saw James sitting on the fallen log, looking disheveled and confused, and her heart sank. "James," she said wearily, "have you been following me all night? Can't you understand? I don't love you. I never will." James looked up at her, and his face showed not the obsessive determination from earlier, but something almost like indifference. The compound had completely rewritten his emotional attachments. Catherine, who should have been the object of his pursuit, now seemed almost irrelevant to him. "Catherine," he said vaguely. "Yes, of course. Have you seen Helena? I need to find Helena." Catherine stared at him, bewildered. "Helena? What does she have to do with anything?" "Everything," James said, standing abruptly. "I've been such a fool. All these years, she's been right there, and I never saw her. Helena, with her kind heart, and her devotion, and her eye, have to find her. I have to tell her how sorry I am, how much I love her." He rushed past Catherine without another glance, leaving her standing alone in complete confusion. The man who'd been obsessively pursuing her hours ago now seemed to have forgotten her existence entirely. "Has everyone gone mad?" Catherine whispered to the uncaring forest. She heard more shouting and followed it to discover a scene that seemed pulled from fever dreams. Helena was backed against a tree, looking terrified, while both Alexander and James circled her like competing suitors, each declaring increasingly elaborate professions of love. "Helena, my darling, you must believe me," Alexander pleaded. "I know I was engaged to Catherine, but that was before I truly saw you. You are my destiny, my fate, my reason for existing." "No, Helena, he's lying," James interrupted. "He's only known you for minutes. I've known you for years, and I've been a blind fool. Forgive me, love me, choose me, both of you, stop." Helena screamed, her composure completely shattered. "This is cruel beyond measure. I know Catherine must have told you to torment me, to punish me for betraying her. But please, I'm begging you, just stop." Catherine emerged from the trees. "Helena, what's happening? I didn't tell anyone to do anything." Helena whirled on her former friend, anger replacing confusion. "Don't pretend innocence. You've turned them against me, made them mock my feelings. Well, congratulations, Catherine. You've destroyed me completely. I hope you're satisfied." "Helena, I don't understand. And you?" Helena turned on Alexander. "You love Catherine. You were eloping with her. This performance is insulting to us both." "Catherine means nothing to me," Alexander said, with brutal honesty, the compound making him incapable of diplomatic lies. "You are all I see, all I want." James shoved Alexander aside. "Get away from her. Helena is mine. I realized it tonight. She's always been mine. Yours." Alexander pushed back. "She's not property. She's a goddess, and I'll fight you for the right to worship her." The two men squared off, their military training evident in their stances. These were soldiers who'd killed in combat, who knew how to hurt and maim. The forest clearing became a potential battlefield. Catherine grabbed Helena's arm. "We need to stop them before someone gets killed. Helena, please, whatever's happened, whatever you think I've done, let them kill each other," Helena said bitterly, tears streaming down her face. "Nothing makes sense anymore. I loved James for years, and he treated me like furniture. Now he claims devotion, and it's obviously mockery. Your Alexander does the same. What am I supposed to believe? That overnight, both men suddenly discovered I exist? It's impossible. It's cruelty disguised as romance." Oberon and Puck watched from concealment, and even Oberon looked disturbed by the chaos unfolding. "This has gone too far," Oberon murmured. "Puck, what exactly did you do?" "What you ordered, sir." "Applied the compound to make them susceptible to." Puck paused. "Oh no. What? I may have gotten the targets slightly wrong. I dosed Lysander and Demetrius, but I think I was supposed to only dose Demetrius." Oberon closed his eyes briefly. "So now both young men are fixated on Helena, and the one who actually loves her thinks she's being mocked. Brilliant. This is exactly the kind of oversight that gets people killed in the field. In my defense, sir, you weren't entirely clear. Fix it," Oberon ordered coldly. "Now, before those two idiots actually hurt each other." In the nearby clearing, Tatiana had convinced Bottom to rest, had given him water and spoken to him with such gentle kindness that the bewildered butcher was beginning to think perhaps being cursed wasn't entirely terrible if it meant receiving this sort of attention. Dawn was still hours away, but the forest had entered that strange liminal time when night is deepest and darkest, when the boundary between reality and dream grows thin as gossamer. Puck moved quickly, retrieving a second vial from his rucksack, the antidote compound, designed to neutralize the first. "I'll need them unconscious again," Puck said. "Can't apply the reversal agent while they're fighting." Oberon stepped from concealment, his voice carrying the command of a man accustomed to absolute authority. Gentlemen, stand down, now." Alexander and James froze, their soldiers' instincts responding to the tone of command even before recognizing the speaker. They turned to see Oberon emerge from shadows, this silver-haired figure who radiated an almost supernatural authority. "Who the hell are you?" James demanded, though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "Someone who's seen too many young men die over stupidity," Oberon replied coldly. "You're both suffering from temporary chemical exposure, a compound that induces fixation and obsession. In approximately 5 minutes, you'll both lose consciousness. When you wake, your heads will ache abominably, but your judgment will be restored." "Chemical exposure," Alexander repeated, confusion cutting through his drug-induced devotion. "What are you talking about?" "Consider it a delayed effect from the war," Oberon said smoothly. "Certain munitions, certain gases, they can have lingering effects on the nervous system. You've both been exposed to something in these woods tonight. It will pass." Even as he spoke, both young men were swaying on their feet. The compound's secondary effects were taking hold, the drowsiness that followed the initial euphoria, the inevitable crash after artificial emotional elevation. Alexander sat down heavily. James stumbled and caught himself against a tree. "I feel very strange," James mumbled. "Helena. I need to tell Helena." "You'll tell her nothing until you're yourself again," Oberon said firmly. "Sleep, both of you." They collapsed within moments of each other, their bodies surrendering to chemical exhaustion. Puck moved in quickly, applying the antidote to both men's closed eyes, reversing the neural pathways the first compound had created. Helena and Catherine watched this impossible scene with shock too deep for words. The mysterious man in the woods, the talk of chemical exposure, the swift and inexplicable collapse of 2 healthy young soldiers was like something from a strange dream, too bizarre to be real, yet too vivid to be imagination. "What have you done to them?" Catherine demanded, finding her voice. "Saved them from their own stupidity," Oberon replied, "and corrected my assistant's error. When they wake, Alexander will remember his love for you, Catherine, and James will remember that he never loved you at all. That obsession is not the same as devotion." "But Helena," Catherine started. "Helena's feelings are her own and always have been," Oberon interrupted. "No compound created them. The question is whether James Demetrius will finally see what's been in front of him all along, or whether he's too much a fool to recognize genuine devotion when it's offered." Helena sank down against a tree, her exhaustion complete. "I don't understand any of this. I don't understand anything anymore." "Understanding is overrated," Puck offered, not unkindly. "Sometimes you just have to wait for morning and hope things make more sense in daylight." Oberon turned to leave, then paused. "Ladies, may I offer advice earned through considerable suffering? Love built on obsession is worthless. Love built on ownership is toxic. Love that survives doubt, distance, and difficulty, that's the only kind worth having. Remember that when these men wake," he disappeared into the forest, Puck following, leaving the 2 young women alone with 2 unconscious men and a night that had demolished all certainty. In the clearing where Bottom rested, Tatiana's own chemical-induced delusions were beginning to fade. She looked at the man with the donkey's head sleeping peacefully nearby, the child curled against his side for warmth, and reality reasserted itself with crushing force. What had she done? She'd proclaimed love for a stranger, had offered herself with desperate abandon, had mistaken loneliness and exhaustion for genuine feeling. The war had broken something in her. She realized had damaged her ability to distinguish between authentic emotion and chemical reaction, between real connection and the desperate need for human warmth. She stood quietly, gathering the child, preparing to resume her journey toward a new life. Bottom would wake eventually, would remove the ridiculous mask, would return to his ordinary existence, and she would become a memory, a strange encounter in the woods, a story he might tell in pubs, but never quite believe himself. "Forgive me," she whispered to the sleeping man. "You deserved better than to be used as a bandage for my broken heart." She walked away into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving Bottom sleeping peacefully, the absurd mask still fixed to his head. The child stirred in her arms, but didn't wake. Somewhere ahead lay the railway station, lay London, lay a ship bound for America and the future she would build from the rubble of her past. Oberon watched her go from a distance, making no move to stop her. Puck stood beside him, uncertain for once. "You're letting her leave, sir." "She's already gone," Oberon replied quietly. "She left months ago, perhaps years. I was simply too focused on the mission to notice. We were good partners in war, Puck. But peace requires different skills, and I possess none of them." They stood in silence, two men shaped by violence and secrecy, uncertain of their place in a world no longer at war. Then Oberon straightened, resuming his mask of cold competence. "Come, let's ensure our meddling hasn't caused permanent damage. The young should have better than what we've become." Catherine sat beside Alexander's unconscious form, Helena beside James's, both women exhausted beyond speech. The forest around them was beginning to lighten, the absolute black of night fading to deep grey. Birds were starting their dawn chorus thrushes, and blackbirds and robins singing territory claims into the awakening day. Alexander stirred first. His eyes opened slowly, focusing with difficulty. His head felt as though it had been split with an axe, and his mouth tasted of copper and chemicals. Memories flooded back in disjointed fragments, waiting for Catherine. A stranger offering a cigarette, falling asleep, and then nothing clear, only confused impressions of shouting and declarations, and Helena's frightened face. "Catherine," he mumbled, seeing her beside him. "What happened? Where are we?" "The woods," Catherine said softly. "You've had a very strange night." "We both have." James woke moments later, groaning and holding his head. He saw Helena watching him warily and felt a rush of confused emotions, embarrassment, shame, and underneath it all, something that might have been recognition. "Helena," he said hoarsely, "did I have fragments of memory. Did I say things, do things?" "You were under the influence of something," Helena said carefully, her voice empty of hope. "That man said it was chemical exposure from the war. You weren't yourself." James sat up slowly, his head pounding. But even through the physical discomfort, he found himself really looking at Helena for perhaps the first time, not as furniture, not as familiar background, but as a person. This woman who'd followed him into dark woods, who'd loved him without hope or encouragement, who'd stayed loyal even when he'd been unspeakably cruel. "I remember what I said to you," James said quietly. "Before whatever happened, I remember telling you that you were like furniture, that I never thought about you at all." Helena flinched but said nothing. "I was wrong," James continued, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "Not about the compound or the confusion about before that. You've been part of my life since childhood, Helena. So constant that I stopped seeing you, stopped appreciating what that constancy meant. The war should have taught me to value loyalty, but I learned nothing. I'm sorry." "Don't," Helena whispered. "Don't apologize because you think you should. Don't offer kindness out of guilt." "I'm offering truth," James said. "It's not love, not yet. Maybe not ever. But it's recognition. You deserve to be seen, Helena. You deserve to be valued. And if you'll let me, I'd like to try to be someone worthy of the devotion you've shown me. It wasn't a declaration of passion. It wasn't the romantic culmination Helena had dreamed of through years of longing, but it was honest, and honesty was perhaps more valuable than romance. Alexander turned to Catherine. "I was running away with you," he said, memory solidifying. "We were going to France. Did you change your mind?" "I got lost in the woods," Catherine admitted. "And then everything became very strange. Alexander, I need to ask you something. Do you love me because you truly love me, or because I represent escape from an ordinary life?" The question hung between them, honest and difficult. Alexander considered it carefully, his head still aching but his thoughts clearing. "I think," he said slowly, "that it might be both. And I think we should probably not make permanent decisions based on one romantic gesture and a night of confusion. I do love you, Catherine. But your father is right about one thing. I have no prospects, no money, no clear future. Maybe that's not enough foundation for marriage." Catherine felt tears threaten, but they were complicated, tears partly sadness, partly relief. "So we're not eloping?" "Not tonight," Alexander said gently. "Maybe not ever. But that doesn't mean we can't see where this leads without running away from it." Dawn broke properly over the forest, sunlight streaming through the canopy in golden shafts that turned the morning mist ethereal. The long, strange night was ending, and with daylight came a restoration of ordinary reality, though none who spent those hours in the woods would ever think of them as entirely ordinary again. Bottom woke to find himself alone in the clearing, stiff and cold and with something very wrong with his head. He reached up and felt the mask still firmly attached, panic rising until he remembered he was near the village. Someone there would have turpentine or solvent. Someone would help him get this damned thing off. He stood, brushing leaves and dirt from his clothes, and tried to make sense of his fragmented memories. There had been a woman, beautiful and foreign, who'd spoken to him with such tenderness. Or had he dreamed that the night felt like a fever, real and unreal simultaneously? "Right then, Bottom," he said to himself, his voice still muffled by the mask. "You've survived the war. You'll survive this oddness too. One foot in front of the other, like always." He made his way through the forest as morning birds sang and rabbits darted through the undergrowth. The woods that had seemed so menacing in darkness now appeared almost benign, just ordinary English countryside in summer. He encountered the other players on the path leading back to the village. They'd spent the night huddled together at the forest's edge, too frightened to go deeper but too committed to their rehearsal to go home. When they saw Bottom approaching still wearing the donkey's head, they froze in terror. "It's me," Bottom called out, waving. "It's still me, for heaven's sake. Quince, Flute, don't run again." Peter Quince, in daylight and exhausted enough that fear had burned itself out, peered at the approaching figure. "Bottom, is that really you under that thing?" "Of course it's me. Who else would it be? I've had the strangest night. Fell asleep, woke up with this mask glued to my head, and then..." He paused, uncertain how to explain the rest. "I dreamed, I think. Or maybe I was awake. I'm not entirely certain." Francis Flute approached cautiously. "We thought you'd been cursed. The woods felt wrong last night, Bottom. Like something from old times, old stories. Felt wrong to me too," Bottom admitted. "But it's morning now. Things always seem clearer in morning. Come on, let's get back to the village. Someone at the chemist's shop will have something to remove this ridiculous contraption." They walked together through the awakening forest. These ordinary working men who survived a war and a strange night and would survive whatever came next because survival was what they'd learned to do. Catherine, Helena, Alexander, and James emerged from the woods at a different point, making their way back toward Ashwood Manor. They walked in a strange configuration, not quite couples, not quite separate, relationships fundamentally altered, but not yet redefined. "What do we tell your father?" Alexander asked Catherine. "The truth, I suppose," Catherine replied. "That we considered eloping, but decided against it. That perhaps we're too young, too unsettled, to make permanent decisions. He'll be relieved, even if he won't show it." James walked beside Helena, maintaining a careful distance but conscious of her presence in a way he'd never been before. "Would you have dinner with me?" he asked quietly. "Properly, I mean. Not an assumption, but an invitation. I'd like to get to know you, Helena. Really know you, not just exist in proximity." Helena looked at him cautiously. "Because you feel guilty?" "Because I'm curious," James replied. "You've loved me for years. I'd like to understand why. I'd like to see what you see, or at least try to." It wasn't everything. It wasn't the fairy tale romance Helena had dreamed of, but it was a beginning, fragile and uncertain but real. At the manor, Lord Theseus stood at his study window, watching dawn paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. He'd spent a sleepless night worrying about Catherine, about the estate, about a future that seemed to slip through his fingers like water, when he saw the four young people emerging from the woods, together. Disheveled and exhausted, but a live relief flooded through him. Perhaps, he thought, the younger generation understood something his own had forgotten, that the old rules didn't always apply. That change, however frightening, was inevitable. That holding too tightly to tradition simply crushed what you were trying to preserve. He would talk with Catherine. Really talk, not issue commands. They would find a solution together, some compromise between duty and desire, between practical necessity and emotional truth. The midsummer celebration was 2 days away. There would be time to sort through the tangles of the night, to make sense of confusion, to chart new courses. The forest, as sunlight conquered shadow, kept its secrets. Oberon and Puck had vanished like morning mist. Tatiana was on a train to London, beginning her journey toward a new life. And the woods themselves, ancient and knowing, simply waited. They had seen lovers and fools, warriors and dreamers, for centuries uncounted. This night was just one more story among thousands, strange and ordinary both. The midsummer celebration arrived under skies that couldn't quite decide between sun and clouds. Weather as uncertain as England's post-war future. Ashwood Manor's gardens had been transformed as best as limited resources allowed, bunting made from saved fabric, flowers from the overgrown gardens arranged in borrowed vases, tables set with mismatched china because the good sets had been sold years ago to pay taxes. The village had turned out in force. These were people who'd survived bombing raids and rationing, who'd endured 6 years of fear and loss, who desperately needed something to celebrate even if the celebration was modest and the victory felt incomplete. Women wore their best dresses, pre-war fashions carefully maintained, altered, passed between sisters and friends. Men wore demob suits or uniforms they couldn't quite afford to replace yet. Children ran through the gardens with the wild energy of those who'd never known peacetime, who thought rationing and rubble were simply how the world was. Lord Theseus stood on the manor's terrace, surveying the gathering with complex emotions. He'd spoken with Catherine the morning after her strange night in the woods, a real conversation. Perhaps the first honest one they'd had since her mother's death 5 years ago. They'd reached an understanding. Catherine would not marry James Demetrius. The estate would survive through economies and sacrifices, through opening rooms to paying guests. through adapting to a world that no longer sustained the old aristocracy in the old ways. It was loss, certainly, but loss had become so familiar these past years that one more seemed almost trivial by comparison. And seeing his daughter smile again, really smile, not the tight, polite expression she'd worn since he'd first insisted on the Demetrius marriage that felt like something worth the cost. Catherine stood with Alexander in the rose garden, far enough from the main gathering for privacy. They'd spent the past 2 days in careful conversation, rebuilding what the chaos of that night had shaken loose. "I've found a position," Alexander said. "Teaching mathematics at a grammar school in Coventry. It doesn't pay much, but it's honest work. A future, of sorts." Coventry, Catherine repeated. The city had been devastated by bombing, were still largely ruins. "That's brave, or desperate," Alexander said, with a self-deprecating smile. "But they need teachers. The children there need education even more than children elsewhere, need to believe that learning matters, that rebuilding is possible." "I thought perhaps I could help with that, and us," Catherine asked quietly. "I'm not asking you to wait for me," Alexander said carefully. "I'm not asking for promises, but I'm asking for time. Let me build something, become someone who can offer you more than romantic poverty. And if, in a year or two, we still feel this way about each other, then we'll see where we stand," Catherine finished. "It's sensible, mature. Everything an elopement isn't. Does sensible disappoint you?" Catherine considered, then shook her head. "No, I think perhaps I was in love with the idea of escape more than I understood. You're right, we need time. We need to discover who we are in peacetime before deciding who we want to be together." They kissed, gently and without desperation, a promise rather than a farewell. James and Helena walked through the gardens together, an awkward new dynamic between them. James had kept his word about dinner, and then another dinner, and conversations that had revealed depths he'd never bothered to explore before. Helena remained guarded, years of unrequited love having taught her to protect her heart, but she was cautiously allowing herself to hope. "My mother thinks I've gone mad," James said with rueful humor, "pursuing the doctor's daughter instead of Lord Theseus's daughter. She keeps mentioning how unsuitable it is." "Is it unsuitable?" Helena asked, her old insecurity surfacing. "Probably," James admitted. "But I've been suitable my entire life, and it's made me into someone I don't particularly like. You make me want to be better, Helena. Not because you demand it, but because you deserve it." "I spent years loving you," Helena said softly. "Now that you're actually here, actually seeing me, I'm terrified I'll discover I was in love with an illusion, that the real you will disappoint me." "I probably will," James said honestly. "I'm spoiled and arrogant, and I've never had to work for anything in my life, but I'm trying to change that. If you be patient with me, and God knows you've been patient far longer than I deserve, maybe I can become someone worth loving back." It wasn't poetry, it wasn't the grand romantic gesture Helena had dreamed of, but it was honest, and increasingly Helena was learning that honesty mattered more than romance. As twilight settled over Ashwood Manor, the guests gathered before an improvised stage planks laid across hay bales, curtains borrowed from the village hall, lanterns strung to provide lighting in the gathering dusk. Peter Quince stood nervously behind the makeshift curtain, his script trembling in his hands, his stutter threatening to return under the weight of anxiety. "Gentlemen," he addressed his troupe in a whisper, "this is our moment. Let's show these people that art matters, that beauty matters, even especially in difficult times." Nick Bottom, the donkey mask finally removed after considerable effort at the chemist's shop, adjusted his costume. He'd been strangely quiet since that night in the woods. less bombastic than usual, as if the experience had fundamentally altered something in him. He'd told no one about the foreign woman, about her tenderness, about how for a few strange hours he'd felt seen and valued in ways he'd never experienced before. Some things were too fragile to speak aloud. "Right," Bottom said simply. "Let's give them something worth watching." The makeshift curtain parted. Quint stepped forward to deliver the prologue, his voice shaking but clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we present for your consideration the most lamentable comedy and most cruel death of Pyramus and Thisbe. Our players are simple men, working men, but we offer you our hearts alongside our humble talents." There was polite applause. The audience consisted of villagers and gentry mixed together in ways that peacetime was making increasingly common. The war had broken down certain barriers, not destroyed them, perhaps, but cracked them enough that light could get through. The play began. Francis Flute appeared as Thisbe, his falsetto voice breaking occasionally but carrying genuine emotion. Tom Snout stood rigid as the wall, his arms forming a chink through which the lovers spoke. Robin Starveling held a lantern high as moonshine, his thin frame casting long shadows. Snug the Carpenter roared unconvincingly as the lion, his stutter somehow adding pathos rather than comedy. And Bottom performed Pyramus with surprising restraint. Gone was the bombastic overacting. Instead, he delivered his lines with simple honesty, making the absurd, tragic tale somehow touching. When Pyramus discovered Thisbe's bloody mantle and believed her dead, Bottom's grief felt real, felt earned by someone who'd known actual loss. "Oh, wherefore, nature, didst thou lion's frame?" Bottom spoke quietly, without theatrical flourish. "Since lion vile hath here deflowered my dear, which is no, which was the fairest dame that lived, that loved, that liked, that looked with cheer." In the audience, Catherine found herself unexpectedly moved. Helena wiped tears away discreetly. Even Lord Theseus, who'd expected to endure amateur theatrics with polite boredom, found himself engaged when Pyramus stabbed himself bottom, falling with deliberate, dramatic grace, and Thisbe discovered her lover's body. Flute's performance transcended the ridiculous costume and falsetto voice. His grief was real, pulled from some well of wartime loss, and the audience felt it. "Asleep, my love." Flute spoke softly as Thisbe. "What? Dead, my dove? O Pyramus, arise, speak, speak, quite dumb. Dead, dead, a tomb must cover thy sweet eyes. These lily lips, this cherry nose, these yellow cowslip cheeks are gone, are gone. Lovers make moan." His eyes were green as leeks. Someone in the audience laughed at green as leeks. But it wasn't cruel laughter, it was the recognition of absurdity mixed with genuine emotion. The kind of laughter that comes from tension released rather than mockery. Thisbe stabbed herself with Pyramus's sword, fell across her lover's body, and the play ended. For a moment there was silence. Then applause began, tentative at first, then building, then genuine and sustained. These working men had offered their hearts, and the audience had received them. Bottom and his troupe took their bows, looking stunned by the reception. They'd expected polite tolerance at best, mockery at worst. Instead, they'd been given something precious, recognition that their effort mattered, that their art had value. Lord Theseus stood and raised his glass. "To our players, who've reminded us that love and loss are universal languages, spoken as eloquently by common men as by poets. Thank you for your gift." More applause. The players retreated behind the curtain, grinning at each other with the exhausted joy of those who've risked vulnerability and survived it. As full darkness fell, lanterns glowed throughout the gardens. Music began, a gramophone playing dance tunes that had been popular before the war. Couples took to the improvised dance floor on the lawn. The celebration continued. This gathering of survivors who'd made it through darkness and were tentatively, cautiously, beginning to hope for light. Catherine danced with Alexander, their future uncertain but no longer terrifying. James danced with Helena, his movements careful, her trust fragile but growing. Lord Theseus danced with the widow of a neighboring estate, both of them grieving their dead spouses but finding comfort in shared loss. At the edge of the gardens, where lantern light faded into darkness, Oberon and Puck stood watching the celebration. They'd returned to observe the aftermath of their meddling, to see whether the chaos they'd created had resolved into something resembling harmony. They seemed to have sorted themselves out, Puck observed. Despite our interference, or perhaps because of it, the young are resilient, Oberon replied. More resilient than we gave them credit for. They survived the war. They can survive a night of confusion and learn from it. And you, sir, have you learned from it? Oberon was silent for a long moment, watching the dancers, the laughter, the fragile joy of people choosing hope over despair. I've learned that manipulation, even well-intentioned manipulation, causes more damage than good. We were soldiers, Puck. We followed orders, executed missions, controlled outcomes. But peace requires different skills. It requires letting go. What will you do now? Disappear, Oberon said simply. Find someplace quiet where a man who's forgotten how to be human can relearn those lessons, if it's not too late. And you? Puck grinned, the expression transforming his scarred face. I think I'll stay nearby. Someone needs to keep an eye on this lot. Besides, I've grown fond of the village. Might even settle down properly. Stop living in shadows. That would be good, Oberon said quietly. You deserve an ordinary life, Puck. You've earned it 100 times over. They clasped hands briefly, not a salute, not a military farewell, but the genuine grip of men who'd survived hell together and were finally, cautiously, stepping toward something better. Then Oberon walked away into the darkness beyond the gardens, becoming one with the shadows he'd inhabited for so long. Puck watched him go, then turned back toward the celebration, toward light and music and the messy, complicated business of being human. Bottom sat with his fellow players at a table laden with modest food sandwiches made from rationed ingredients, cakes sweetened with honey because sugar was still scarce, beer from the village pub. They were flushed with success, talking over each other, reliving their triumph. Did you see Lady Pemberton crying during my death scene? Bottom said wonderingly. Actual tears. You were good, Bottom, Quince admitted. We all were. Better than we knew we could be. Perhaps we should do another, Flute suggested. A comedy next time, something lighter. They began planning immediately. These men who'd found purpose in performance, who'd discovered that creating beauty was its own form of resistance against a world that had tried to destroy beauty entirely. As midnight approached, Lord Theseus called for silence. The crowd gathered, conversation dying to expectant hush. Friends, Lord Theseus said, his voice carrying across the gardens. We've endured much these past years. We've lost people we loved. We've seen our world shaken to its foundations. Tonight, we celebrate not just midsummer, not just victory, but survival. And more than survival, the possibility of renewal. He paused, looking at the assembled faces, villagers and gentry, young and old, the wounded and the whole. All of them marked by war, in visible and invisible ways. The old rules are changing, he continued. The old certainties are gone. Perhaps that's terrifying, but perhaps it's also liberation. We have the chance to build something new, something better. not by clinging to what was, but by embracing what might be. He raised his glass to new beginnings, to love that's chosen rather than arranged, to art created by working hands, to communities that care for all their members, not just the privileged few, to England battered, weary, but enduring, and to all of us who've made it through the darkness and deserve whatever light we can find, to new beginnings. The crowd echoed, glasses raised, voices united. Catherine stood with Alexander, Helena with James, and for this moment at least, the future seemed less frightening than promising. They didn't know what would come, whether their relationships would endure, whether peace would hold, whether the new world being born would be better than the old one dying. But they knew they'd survived, and survival, they'd learned, was its own form of courage. The celebration continued into the small hours. Music playing, couples dancing, children finally sleeping on blankets, while adults talked and laughed and dared to hope. The manor's lights glowed against the darkness, a small, defiant beacon of warmth and community in a world still finding its balance. In the woods beyond, the ancient trees stood witness, as they'd stood witness to countless human dramas before. The forest kept its secrets, the strange night when love went astray and was restored, when ordinary men became players, when the powerful learned humility and the humble found dignity. Morning would come, as it always did. Life would continue with all its complications and compromises and imperfect resolutions. But tonight, this midsummer night in 1946, belonged to celebration, to hope, to the stubborn human insistence that joy matters even when the world has forgotten how to be joyful. The music played on, the dancers danced, and England, battered but unbroken, turned its face toward dawn and whatever future waited there.